welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got Kipp Adams and Benjamin Wolk with me on this Thursday afternoon. And it's sort of a semi-breaking news podcast. We're a few hours at this point, less than a day removed from the point of this podcast. And it is that Nick Saban has announced his retirement. Happened on Wednesday evening. First reported by ESPN's Chris Lowe that Saban, 72 years old, will not return to Alabama, stepping away after an incredible career at Alabama. Tons of success in his career overall. 7 national titles, 6 of which he won at Alabama. Overall, 297 career wins through his various stops at the college level. So I want to do this podcast so we could sort of talk about the news, break it down, talk about it from an Alabama perspective, but also from how this affects the Georgia Bulldogs. I'm going to start with you, Kipp. Where were you when you heard this news? And just what were your immediate thoughts about Nick Saban deciding to retire?
I mean, I'll be honest, I was still just scanning Falcons coaching news because as of when the news broke, we had yet to leak out that we were interviewing anyone. And so all I was left with was, Bill Belichick responses. And so I was just waiting for any name, out there. And so when I saw it from Chris Lowe, like I had to look through each letter of the handle to make sure there wasn't a 0 in there for the O, an I in there for the L, make sure that was his account. And then I still read it a couple more times, had to kind of take it in because obviously this is not just the biggest college football news of the year. I mean, it's decade. You can just go back as far as you want. This is as big as it gets. And so it's definitely the end of an era. And I just spent the rest of the night, trying to take it all in and think back, and so many memories of how he shaped the sport and, kind of made it what it is, for the most part, what it is now. This is definitely one of those moments where you think about where you were at that time. I can't think about what this sport is going to be like without him, but the impact is just, off the charts as far as what Nick Saban brought to college football.
Ben, what about you? Where were you when you heard the news, and what were your immediate thoughts?
Yeah, I was actually on the phone with true story. I was on the phone with an Alabama fan as I read Chris Lowe's tweet. And much like the person on the other side of the phone, they did not believe me. I did not necessarily believe that it was the real Chris Lowe. I think I did what probably everyone did, said, hey, let me confirm that this is the real Chris Lowe that this is coming from. Shocking. I mean, I think that it's one of those things. It's weird because we've talked about this happening for 10 years now. For 10 years, people have said, oh, the time's coming. This is the year. This is when it's happening. And I think we all probably reached a point where it's, all right, it's never going to happen. Or when it does happen, it's just going to, it's going to be so far off that it's ridiculous how long we had the conversation. And then it kind of happens and it makes you wonder, what was it really that made him realize that now is the time? Because I don't think that anyone believes that, he was any further away from being able to find success in this sport. I'm sure that it probably hurts Georgia folks a little bit, but I think it's, fitting ending for him to probably upset Georgia in some senses in the last chance that they have the opportunity to play together. I assume that he probably knew in that moment. And we've all seen the clips of him and Kirby Smart before the SEC championship game. And I'm sure Nick Saban knew in that moment. I don't know whether or not Kirby Smart knew in that moment or not, but it's definitely one of those clips you look back on and you say, all right, I mean, it was sort of a fitting way for it all to go down with those two sort of de facto passing the torch from one another. It's just weird. It's weird. I really never thought, it's one of those things. I never thought that we would be doing this podcast. I never thought that the day would come that Nick Saban would actually step away from Alabama.
Yeah, it's crazy. And just to sort of talk about my experience, it was funny. So Georgia men's basketball played 9 p.m. Eastern time tip, and we'll talk about that at the very end. But I have the wherewithal about myself. I'm not a night owl. I was like, I'm going to take a nap because I'm going to crash before this game if it's going to be that late. I'm not kidding you guys. I woke up, was kind of getting up, getting ready to go, and was just looking at my phone, and then Chris Lowe's tweet popped up. And I did the exact same thing you guys did, and I'm sure everybody did, was make sure that was his account. And I even, if you go back and look at where I posted on the board, I made it a point to say, we don't know if Chris Lowe's been hacked. Like, I did not, I want to make it clear, that anything could happen but with it being Chris Lowe, I thought there was a pretty good chance that it was legit once we figured out that was his handle. And yeah, it's sort of bizarre to think about, when you've, especially if you're like my age and Ben's age, we were really probably watching the sport more than ever when Alabama came to prominence under Nick Saban. And, I wrote a column about this on Wednesday. I'm sure there are Georgia fans across the country who are celebrating, maybe popped a little champagne knowing, oh, we don't got to deal with Nick Saban anymore. But I feel like he was a really important part of Georgia and their story and what they've done and being able to win that national title. And I wrote this in the column. If Georgia had beaten anybody else for that first national title, everybody, including Georgia fans, would have still had they still can't beat Alabama. Yeah, we've won this national title, but we still have to beat Alabama. And I think that only added to that national title. And I want to make sure I mention Kirby Smart was on the radio 92.9 The Game this morning talking about Nick Saban. Just wanted to share what he had to say. Kirby said he had a huge impact on my career. First of all, a lot of respect for him as a coach and as a person and as a man. I mean, what he and Miss Terry have meant to really the game of football, but especially to Tuscaloosa, they've been incredible. I mean, he put a lot of coaches through his coaching factory. I can assure you that. He's really good at what he does. And from what I hear, he was still working and coaching to the last minute. Kirby talked about he was sort of shocked, but, he really appreciated the fact that, Nick could go out on his own terms. And a piece of this that I think is interesting, we talk about his decision. If he was going to pick a time to leave, I do think this is the right time. You're getting ready for a big change. Texas and Oklahoma coming in the SEC, a 12-team playoff, a lot of new things. I think it makes sense if you are going to pick a time, and even if it's been on your mind, I can kind of see Nick looking around and saying, this is about as good of a time as any to call it a career, let someone else step in here and take the reins.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that it's hard not to look at the times in college football right now and wonder whether Nick Saban kind of is as fed up with it as a lot of other folks are. And just knowing the waters that he's having to navigate in are just different than they were. And to your point, going to a 12-team era with a much bigger SEC, it's just, if the time was ever to happen, it's now. Because to your point, if he gets into it a couple of years into this new era, the way that he's wired, he probably digs his teeth fully into it for an extended period of time beyond that. So the timing probably did work out well for him. But I've said out loud to myself multiple times over the last 24 hours, I can't believe Nick Saban retired. Like, I've actually had to verbalize it out loud multiple times.
I think Goat Dog on YouTube is sharing the sentiments that I think a lot of Georgia fans are. We put meat on the grill all weekend, fellas, which I get it, and I had family members who are huge Georgia fans who were texting me just elated, and I get it. But, you got to give Nick Saban his credit and props for what he's done. And I can't help but think, he's retiring. Bill Belichick is no longer with the Patriots. Pete Carroll, out with the Seahawks. I thought about the joke from like the early 2000s as like, we used to have Bob Hope and Johnny Cash. Now we have no Hope, no Cash. I can't remember the other name that's in that. But it's a changing of the guard in football in general. And it's kind of wild to see. Let's talk about this for a little bit from the Georgia perspective. And I'm going to start with you, Ben, just more so on the recruiting side of things. How do you feel like this affects Georgia, knowing that, Alabama's not going to go away, and we're going to talk about who we think could wind up in that job, but it is going to look very different without Nick Saban. And, what could that do? What kind of effect could that have for Georgia when it comes to recruiting these future classes?
Well, and this might be a slightly controversial comment, but I would say Georgia's probably won more recruiting battles against Alabama than it's lost over the last 3 years. So just recently, or in recent history, I feel like Georgia has probably sort of no pun intended, to sort of turn the tide in terms of who has the upper hand in those recruiting battles more often than not. I think without knowing who Alabama is going to hire yet, it's really hard to say what specifically it means for recruiting. And I'm sure we'll talk about potential candidates and things like that for Alabama as well. But when Greg Byrne put out his statement last night, he led with recruiting and relationship building as the number one thing that he's going to be looking for from the next hire. You would assume that they're going to hire somebody that is very successful from a recruiting standpoint in this era, which the list of those names is relatively limited. I don't know exactly whether Alabama can just handpick who it is that they want. But from a Georgia standpoint, like I really, it's hard for me to say until I know who they hire. Like if they go and hire someone that Georgia's had a bunch of recruiting battles against, like, and again, I'm sure we're going to throw out names, and this is just a purely hypothetical, like Steve Sarkisian, for instance, not someone that I think has any reason to take the Alabama job whatsoever, but he has won recruiting battles against Georgia recently. He knows what it takes to recruit at a high level in this league. So I think that if someone like that gets hired at Alabama, it probably softens the blow for Alabama in terms of retaining their current roster, but also just diving headfirst into the 2025 recruiting class. I don't think it's as easy as that, because I think the pool of candidates that you want to hire probably isn't as readily available as it once was, because in the NIL space, a lot of schools have their stuff figured out in terms of how they can build really, really good rosters. It's not just, I feel like in the past, it's been 1 or 2, 3 schools that really have the organization in place to be able to recruit at the level that you need to. I think the number of schools that have that now in this NIL era is greater. And so you look at someone like Dan Lanning that's already turned down the Alabama job. You look at, a guy like Steve Sarkisian. I don't know that the Alabama job is that much better than some of these jobs in these, at this point in time that you're going to go hire a surefire top of the line recruiter. If they do that, I don't think it really changes a whole lot. But if they don't do that, I think that Kirby Smart's probably licking his chops right now, knowing that one of his biggest recruiting competitions, but without question, really his only on-field competition over the last several years, is no longer there.
And I'll just go ahead and say this for the Georgia fans listening. Don't anticipate or don't see a world where Kirby Smart is a candidate for this job. I've had a few people ask, well, hey, what's Kirby's buyout? I don't think he's leaving his alma mater to go replace Nick Saban. Kipp, same question to you that I asked Ben. What do you think this does for Georgia? Any effect at all? Maybe more so on the recruiting side, that Nick Saban is no longer the head coach of the Crimson Tide.
Yeah, obviously, like Ben said, we have to wait and see who the coach is. And I think you just kind of look at the recruiting rankings. You see Alabama right there behind, Georgia. Texas is right there as well. Obviously, Dan Lanning saying no. Oregon at number 6. So really, Mike Norvell at Florida State, number 10. So outside of 2 candidates, you're going to get a guy who's not currently recruiting at a top 10 level for his program. So there's a huge chance for a lot of change there. But recruiting's now just become like an individual. The elite players at each position. NIL is a huge presence for, like wide receivers, a lot of the skill position, definitely quarterback. You have to kind of work in the margins. You have to get the elite players at maybe other positions, linemen coming out of high school. You have to really figure out what your priorities are in recruiting with NIL. And I just think that there are a lot of variables involved with that. I'm just kind of interested because I kind of look at it as a, maybe like the end of a Cold War type of thing where Nick Saban made Kirby Smart the coach he is. The fact that, he pushed him when he was an assistant to the, as hard as you can. And then as a head coach, he continued to chip away at him, and Kirby Smart made Nick Saban a better coach by doing the same thing when he got to Georgia. Winning recruiting battles in the state of Alabama, or winning recruiting battles, period, that Nick Saban didn't lose. I think they drove each other to be better coaches the last 7 years, 8 years. And I think it's, I'm watching a show on Apple, For All Mankind, where you're in an alternate reality where the space race continued. And you just look at all the technological advances that came from that, similar to the Cold War. When you're pushing each other as hard as you are, there's positives to come from that. And so now, who is going to push Kirby Smart? Will it be a coach? Will it just be college football, the landscape itself? And, the fact that it's the calendar, it just never goes away. That's kind of the interesting thing here. I think obviously this is good news for Georgia. The biggest competition is out of the way, but you're not sure whether the next coach is going to keep Alabama at that level. So is Kirby Smart going to have that same motivation if, college football has one less competitor for him, if it becomes easier for him to have the success he has, if he starts winning recruiting battles that maybe Nick Saban would have won before? He's already made the comment, and he made it with Nick Saban, talking about how long he plans on coaching. And so when you see that your mentor step aside after beating you, I think that there's a change involved there that maybe we're not really projecting right now. We're just thinking, okay, now that the GOAT is gone, Kirby Smart can take that next step and be that next guy, and he might be able to. He's better prepared than any coach in college football. He won his first national championship when he was, I think, 5 years younger than Saban won his first. So I think he's well set up for it. But Nick Saban left because he knew that this isn't the college football he walked into. And he evolved so many times. And I think he got to his final form and said, I can't evolve anymore. It's up to Kirby Smart to figure out if he's going to be able to continue to evolve in a very different landscape than Saban dominated. And so that's kind of the real question right now from a recruiting standpoint, and then from a transfer portal standpoint. Kirby's roster, I mean, it's the best roster in college football right now. So, I think those are kind of marginal improvements that can be made in recruiting. If you're going down Alabama's roster right now and you're just seeing which guys are we going to pick apart in the next 30 days, I mean, there's not a lot of room on Georgia's roster. Those things figure themselves out, but there aren't a lot of positions right now where Georgia can really get a lot better. I mean, their roster from top to bottom is arguably better than Alabama's right now. So I think going to, you can celebrate, definitely, grill as much as you can this weekend and enjoy this end of an era for being good news for Georgia overall. But I think that kind of that impact is probably not as big as you expected to be.
Yeah, I think it's all going to depend, as we talked about, on who they hire. And I saw someone in the comments asking about who could Georgia go get from that roster. I think it's going to depend on who they hire, because a lot of those guys may decide to stay put. And I wanted to mention too, I wrote this in the column on Wednesday. More than anything, it's just going to be so surreal to be in Tuscaloosa in September when Georgia plays, and to look out there and to see somebody who is not Nick Saban on that sideline. It just really doesn't feel real. We're going to take a quick break, come back, and throw out some names that we think could be in the mix at Alabama, and try to figure out what's going to happen with this coaching search. Well, as Ben mentioned earlier, on Thursday, Dan Lanning announced that he is not leaving Oregon. He is staying put. I believe at one point he was the betting favorite to replace Nick Saban. So, guys, let's give our predictions of who gets this job. Not necessarily who would be our top candidates, but who we think will wind up replacing Nick Saban. Before we do that, little piece of history. I'm going to put you guys on the spot. Can either of you name who replaced Bear Bryant as Alabama head coach?
No shot.
Man, yeah, I'm drawing a complete blank right now. I looked at it yesterday because I was looking at, you want to be the guy after the guy after the guy, and I thought, the list of coaches were not memorable at all, and so I don't know if you want to be any of those guys. That's my last thoughts, but I cannot remember.
Ray Perkins. as the coach from 83 to 86 did not go well. I think Bill Curry replaced him. And like Kipp just said, you kind of want to be the guy after the guy after the guy, because that was Stallings who won a national title and kind of had that run where Alabama was relevant again for the first time since Bear. So I sort of bring that up to say I think there's going to be a lot of people who pass on this job, just as Dan Lanning did on Thursday. I think that the expectations, I don't, other than when Bear Bryant was replaced, there's really no comparison to me of the expectations a coach is going to be stepping into replacing a legend like Nick Saban. So I'll go first, guys. I'm going to say Washington head coach Kalen DeBoer is the next Crimson Tide head coach. He's had a lot of success. I think the job he did this year has gotten a lot of people's attention. I think really more than anything, would need to work really hard to bring Ryan Grubb, his offensive coordinator, with him. Somebody that Nick tried to hire this offseason, wound up staying at Washington, then he hires Tommy Rees instead. But I think Alabama's going to swing for the fences and go after some big names like a Dan Lanning, like some of the other guys, Steve Sarkisian at Texas. But I think a lot of people are going to look at their situation and compare it to what you're walking into in Tuscaloosa and just say, I'm not taking that. And, could wind up getting pay bumps at where they're at, which I think is the best situation for some of those guys. But I want to say Kalen DeBoer gets the job, comes over from Washington, doesn't have the regional ties, which I do think would be a little interesting. But in today's day and age, I don't think it's quite as dire. It would just be on him to hire some really good assistants around him. All right, Kipp, who do you think winds up replacing Nick Saban?
Yeah, I really like that pick, just except for the Southeastern footprint. I mean, you're coming in to Alabama, you're coming into SEC. I get it, NIL plays a big factor, but as far as connecting with recruits in the Southeast, I just think it's going to be such a tough sell. And I was looking at when Saban was hired, Mike Shula was fired on November 27th. Saban wasn't hired until January 3rd. I mean, how did Alabama fans even survive 37 days of not knowing who their coach was going to be? I guess they were just in the misery pit already. It's been one day, and I think there's a lot of reaction right now probably about Lanning, and you never knew that where he was on the board, guys. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many Alabama fans are watching this right now, but I'm just saying, if any Georgia fans have any Alabama fans that they have any care in the world about, they want to make them feel slightly better before cracking more jokes, you have to let them know that Lanning was just a guy that everyone said made sense. That has nothing, I think that the administration in Alabama had a plan in place, has had a plan in place for a long time, has had input from Nick Saban. And if you're going to kind of put it out there that this is going to be a 72-hour thing, that, something might happen, I guess, if we're counting that, it happened yesterday at 4, broke. So Saturday afternoon, I don't think that's a situation where you're just going to go out there and run through 10 candidates and not know who your guy is going to be. For me, my line of thinking is, who is this actually going to improve their situation? You mentioned, DeBoer, you mentioned Sarkisian. Like, those guys have really good situations right now. They're set up. Like Dan Lanning, you looked at it and go, it makes sense, but why leave Oregon? Like, you were set up with the fast track for the college football playoff for the next decade where you're at right now. And obviously at Oregon, the money's not going to be an issue either. And so for me, I'm thinking, who just got screwed? And that's Mike Norvell. He sees the situation at Florida State right now as untenable. If I go undefeated and I don't make the playoff, what's the point of me being here? And so, and you look at him rebuilding that program in 4 years. I mean, they had 3 wins his first year, and they should have been they did everything they could to be in the college football playoff. I think he doesn't have SEC experience, but he shows he can build a program. He's young. The buyout obviously won't be an issue. He's recruiting in the Southeast. I think he makes the most sense as someone where they know, they know he'll say yes, and they know that he's right there with the other top choices. And Sarkisian makes a lot of sense too, but I mean, their quarterback just announced he's coming back. So it's kind of like he probably his people probably were like wanting an answer from Sarkisian before making that announcement. So the timing for me seems a bit off, although he can announce that and transfer to Alabama next week if we wanted to, because that's just the landscape. But I think as of right now, that's who makes the most sense as someone Alabama can get, because I think everyone thinking that Alabama can get anyone. It's just the job is you have to be completely fearless and have that type of mindset that you can come in and follow the greatest coach of all time. And I just don't think that, even though these guys have, the egos, their confidence, I think at the end of the day, they look at that and go, that job, no matter who they hire, fans are going to be disappointed. You can't hire anyone where someone isn't going to be like, why didn't, he's not good enough. And so if people are going to say you're not good enough on day one, no matter what, then that probably eliminates a lot of the guys at the very top of the coaching tree right now.
Ben, who do you think winds up coaching Alabama in 2024?
I've been grappling with this big time because I think Greg Burns' statement and leading with recruiting, and again, I realize recruiting is obviously a part of it, but him coming out there and in the first two sentences saying recruiting and relationship building is going to be, the primary reason or factor that I'm going to be factoring in here. The options are pretty limited. If that's your important criteria, there's not a ton of elite recruiters out there. It's like I'm looking at the top 10, 15 in the 24/7 sports team rankings. And it's like, there's some coaches with ties to Alabama that sort of make sense. But to Kipp's point, I think you got to ask the question, like, do they view the Alabama job in its current state as a better job than what they currently have? And for like Sarkisian, and for instance, at Texas, I think it's a no-brainer. Texas is a better spot to be in right now. I mean, Cristobal is a name that I haven't heard mentioned at all, but it's like, if you get down the list and you're looking for elite recruiters, is that possible? Like, Hugh Freeze would be hilarious.
Keep going.
Kelly would be hilarious. Brent Venables, actually, I'll say I have a tweet from 5 years ago saying that Brent Venables would be the next Alabama head coach. I don't think that's going to happen, but if it does, you'll see that tweet. If it doesn't happen, you'll never see it. But I lean towards what Kipp's saying here. When you look at all those teams, how many of them are in situations where they feel like it is a significant upgrade or it's a better job for them to go to Alabama? The list is pretty thin. And I think right now you look at the state of the ACC compared to the SEC and the Big Ten. And I think that any coach that is a big-time college football coach or considers them as such is going to do whatever they can to get into the SEC or the Big Ten at the first opportunity that they can get. Mike Norvell is the prime candidate there because of what he's done this season, the recruiting chops that he has shown at times. I still think that's a really risky hire for Alabama, but you're replacing Nick Saban. Every hire that you make is going to be a risky hire. So if they're not going with that top group of, so-called elite recruiters in college football, like maybe they dip into the NFL ranks like they've done in the past. I don't know. But if recruiting's important to you, there's only a couple names that I feel like would take that job that are interested.
I don't know why anyone in the NFL would go to college football right now. It's it's an easier job being an NFL coach right now. And you actually have somewhat of an off season, but to your point, I guess if you're going on the list, I mean, we haven't brought up, Kiffin. And that's the one guy who's the true wild card of wild cards who would have that mindset. He's the one guy who wouldn't care, doesn't really care what people think. And I think that's the one guy. If it's not Norvell, Kiffin would make the most sense just because, he could tweet he's not leaving the second before he leaves. And, he already has 9 tweets, already scheduled for when he gets to Tuscaloosa. So I think that's kind of the one X factor of X factors that if you just want to, watch the world burn, you give Kiffin that job and just step back and go, I had no idea this was going to happen 2 years from now whenever, college football is just turned completely upside down by, his tenure with the Crimson Tide.
I'm
Imagine
curious.
you go ahead, Ben.
Well, I just saw Russ Henry here in the comment section. I don't want to detour this too much, but I'm curious, how many coaches do you think are ahead of Glenn Schumann? Like, at what point, how many no's does Alabama get before they say, all right, we're willing to take the chance. And it might be a year or two too early for Glenn Schumann, but I also think that he's wired in a way where if he gets an Alabama job, he's going to take it and run with it.
I think Schumann's set up to be the guy after the guy. I mean, I think that's exactly where his timeline is, whether that's still at Georgia or whether going to another program and having some success there. I think as of right now, he is definitely set up to be, if whoever takes this job doesn't go on a decade-long run, I think Schumann is definitely set up to be the guy that, after this guy crashes and burns.
I think Kipp's right. And I think that I would have to imagine Greg Byrne is hesitant to hire someone who's never been a head coach before. That doesn't mean it couldn't work. Georgia did that with Kirby Smart, but it seems like a pretty big risk replacing Nick Saban. But it could be a situation where a lot of people pass on this job and they say, all right, we're going to get a guy that's been here and was part of that success and turn it over to Glenn Schumann. I want to say, too, I like the Mike Norvell pick a lot. He was someone I had as one of my top candidates. But imagine going back in time to that time that Jacksonville State, which is in Alabama, beat Florida State. Like, you could time travel and say, hey, that guy's going to be the guy that replaces Nick Saban. I would just love to have the ability to have done that. Before we get out of here, go ahead, Kip.
Well, if you're going full circle on that, who's the head coach at Jacksonville State right now?
Rich Rodriguez.
And so that is the complete time as a full circle right there. He's the reason all this is happening right now. So again, thanks to Rich Rod for turning the Alabama job down. Maybe you get to say that in the end, you set him up for success a second time, and beating the future head coach of Alabama football in the year 2023. That would be incredible. Just to have that connections. There's just so many connections between the coaches. Just the fact that, Pete Carroll was let go yesterday and Nick Saban followed him at Ohio State. Just the fact that Pete Carroll went to Ohio State for the defensive coordinator job in 1980. And who was the coach there at the time? I mean, it was Monty Kiffin. And so there's just all the different levels and connections to this. This is like the coaching tree in college football. So good luck to Alabama. If you're gonna go to your option 3 and option 4, we're all here for it. This is what we've kind of all been waiting for, because you've had the run of runs over the last 17 years, and now you get the experience in the social media age of what it's like to not go to sleep knowing you have the greatest coach in college football, in your program. So good luck, guys.
I've been playing the game with myself of what could be the funniest hire that Alabama could make. And it hadn't occurred to me Hugh Freeze until we were on this. And I was just going down that list and mentioned his name because that would be pretty funny. But I've landed on Dan Mullen, but I'm curious to know who else, what you all have landed on that would be funnier than that.
Let me set it up because I was going to do this before we close the podcast. What about a former Saban assistant, played in the state of Alabama, coached in the state of Alabama for quite a while, had a Heisman-winning quarterback from the state of Alabama, won a national title, was the first Nick Saban assistant to beat Nick Saban, just missed the playoff in 2020 in that very, very weird year. Jimbo Fisher is the next head coach of the Alabama Crimson Tide.
I mean, I had a real thought about this yesterday with Jimbo. It's like people would laugh that thought off immediately. And then the more you think about it, it's like, well, is there anybody that knows how to build a program better than him that would be just openly, willingly to jump on that opportunity immediately? Like I did the same thing. I laughed. I was like, man, that would be hilarious. And then it's like, wait a minute. Jimbo Fisher in a weird way might make sense when it's all said and done.
I think the last I looked, he had 100 to 1 odds. Same odds as Jim Harbaugh. So get in there while you can right now. If you can get those odds now. I think that was the same as Kirby Smart as well. So jump on it now. I like it. Jimbo Fisher. Let's put that out there.
Hey, I'm just going to throw this out there too. Think about when, a guy went from Texas A&M to Alabama. That's what Bear Bryant did. I'm telling you, there's a path there to success. Kipp, is there somebody that stands out to you, I should say, as far as what would be the funniest thing Alabama could do?
Goodness. I mean, I think as far as just making me laugh, just the fact that, Butch Jones, if we're talking about like just redemption story, a guy that I think doing fairly well at Arkansas State, has already, had been in the Southeast. If you bring Butch Jones back to the SEC, the only way you can really build Alabama back up is going brick by brick, and so I think he's the guy that I would get on board, just because I think we'd all be better for it. Memes have come a long way since the last time he was the head coach at Tennessee. And I just think that he has what it takes. Bring in Jim McElwain as well. Those are guys that we need to get some of these guys back in the conference, because the last couple of years, I think, been kind of tame. Just kind of a blue collar attitude. Not a lot of like outbursts. I think we need to get guys back in here to get this thing rolling, because it feels like Lane's just been talking to himself the last couple of years. And, I want this to be as close to WWE as you can get it. So some of these guys that have had those kind of moments in the conference before, if Alabama misses on 12 or 13 guys and somehow Schumann says no as well, we can start to get to those levels. And I mean, Georgia fans, we'll all be better for it if things like this happen. So let's just, again, I'm sure they'll have a great hire in the next couple of days, and they'll have a lot of the energy will be at a high level. The next 30 days, the recruiting will have the boost. But until that happens, let's just let them kind of let's just let this marinate a little bit and put the energy out there that you heard on this podcast, that Butch Jones, Jimbo Fisher are serious candidates for the Alabama job.
Shout out BML as well on YouTube. Ray Perkins would be a hilarious hire for Alabama.
Yeah, rest in peace, Ray Perkins. Before we get out of here, Georgia men's basketball minute. A lot going on, and a lot of good things, I should say, happening for the Bulldogs. Beat Arkansas 76-66 on Wednesday night. Guys, Georgia is 12-3 so far, 2-0 in SEC play for the first time in a decade. Very impressive performance against the Razorbacks. True in that game led for like 39 minutes and 2 seconds of the 40 minutes. Things are going in the right direction for Georgia. This is their longest win streak since 1948, when Ralph Shug Jordan, the guy who's most known for his time as Auburn's football coach, was Georgia's basketball coach. So things are going really well. Georgia hosts Tennessee at noon on Saturday. I would encourage anyone around Athens, if you can get a ticket, go, because I think it's going to be a really fun game. And for the second straight game, Georgia plays a team that is coming off a loss, and they handled that really well to Razorbacks. Time will tell if they can do that against the number 5 Volunteers. Before we get out of here, Kipp, I mentioned this before we started recording. I really made a mistake when we recorded on Wednesday by not bringing up the fact that the Atlanta Falcons job is now open. So I want to hear from you before we get out of here. Who is your pick? Who do you want to be the next Atlanta Falcons head coach?
Well, I'd love, obviously, Ben Johnson with the Detroit Lions is the pick a lot of people really like. I think you have to find kind of that happy medium between an up-and-comer as far as not having head coach experience, and then also realize that Arthur Smith is not the youngest owner out there right now. The medium for me, I'll be honest, Todd Monken with the Baltimore Ravens. I just think that he kind of makes the most sense. You need a guy who actually is a credible offensive coordinator, not a glorified O-line tight ends coach who then comes in who doesn't bring in a quarterbacks coach. And so having gone through that with Arthur Smith, I think Todd Monken makes the most sense, knowing that the Falcons are a top 3 job overall when you look at what's available on the roster, the offensive weapons, who better to actually unlock Kyle Pitts and, make him maybe look like he's worth a top 5 pick than Todd Monken and what he's done with the tight end position. So knowing that there's no chance the Falcons actually end up with him, I've already made peace with the fact that it will be Bill Belichick, because those guys are basically the same age right now. And so they probably already had people mailing each other to tell each other they were interested, using whatever forms of communication you use at that age. And so you have to go through your stages of grief and just know that whoever the top 3 people are, like the guys I just mentioned, just go ahead and strike them off the list, because there's zero chance they're the head coach of the Falcons. And again, once you make peace with that, you can go ahead and move on and know that the coach that brought the most pain to the Falcons will be their head coach moving forward.
Arthur Blank is the reason that stamp prices keep going up, is what I've learned from this conversation. And yeah, my only thing with Todd Monken, I don't want that for him. As a longtime Falcons fan, why would you wish ill on that man? That is the meanest thing you could do, is to want him to be the Falcons coach. Ben Johnson is the guy I like. I'd obviously be very excited if it was Todd Monken. Ben, I don't even really know. Are you a Falcons fan? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah,
any input on this
if
job?
you can call it that, I guess you could say so. I mean, I'm a supporter of Atlanta sports. I'd hire Nick Saban. Pretty easy.
About the same age as
NFL
Belichick.
experience.
Yeah.
NFL experience. Maybe he'll bring Kirby Smart as his defensive coordinator.
Has a home in the state of Georgia. Why not?
You heard it from Ben Wolk first, folks. We will wrap up the episode right there. I appreciate Kipp and Ben for popping on. Appreciate everyone who watched this live, everyone who is listening to this after the fact. Be sure to go to dogs247.com. Go subscribe. We'll have all Georgia-related content when it comes to this Alabama coaching search on there, and we will have reactions as that job is hired, and we'll have reactions over what looks like it's going to be a very big weekend for Georgia recruiting. A lot of players coming in and visiting this weekend. Also go to Dogs247 on YouTube. You can watch all these podcast episodes, Mike White interviews, Georgia men's basketball interviews, and then once we get to spring ball, Kirby Smart press conferences and player interviews there as well. So for Kipp Adams and Benjamin Wolk, I am Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.